I think more generally, Bitcoin's narrative has kind of changed in the sense that, nobody's really thinking about payments at all anymore. If we don't figure out a few additional advancements there, I think the integrity of the system as a whole really starts to come into question. And I think Bitcoin desperately needs to be thinking about that question a little bit harder than it is right now.
Permissionless, the crypto industry's leading developer conference, is coming to Brooklyn this June 24th to the 26th. And this time, Bitcoin is showing up in a big way. That's right. With confidence in Ethereum and Solana on the decline, interest in Bitcoin development is riding high. And yet the way forward for many builders remains unclear. Layer 2s, meta protocols, soft fork upgrades. We'll be talking about the future of Bitcoin and how and if it needs to change. Of course, tickets are going fast. You can get them today at blockworks.co. We'll see you there. Hey everybody, this episode of Supply Shock is powered by Core. You're going to hear a lot more about them later in this episode, but first, a word from our sponsors.
Core is the Bitcoin consumer chain. Stake your Bitcoin, explore Bitcoin DeFi, and earn rewards today. Visit stake.coredao.org/blockworks. You'll hear more about them later in the episode.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, here on today's episode of Supply Shock. We're bringing on one of Bitcoin's most senior core developers, someone whose work spans the breadth of the Bitcoin code base from his work at Chain Code Labs on key infrastructure. It's innovations like OpVault, a widely touted soft fork proposal many say would bring improvements for Bitcoin custody and custody products. To work like a Assume UTXO and CoinStats Index. These are optimizations to the software that if you're running a node, you are running and it secures your monetary sovereignty. Also, one of the pull requests for some of the most contested soft forks at the moment, OpCTV and OpCheck from Stacks. Welcome to the podcast, James O'Byrne. How you doing?
Pete, thanks for having me on. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and this conversation has been a long time coming. I know we've had a few chats here and there, but certainly excited to dig in. I know you're someone who thinks really deeply about the future of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin code base, and that right now, depending on who you're asked, there's either too much consternation about the status quo, or maybe not enough. So I know we were just at the OpNext conference last weekend. This would be a kind of major forum bringing together different parts of the Bitcoin ecosystem, Bitcoin developers as well. Curious for your thoughts and temperatures on what you saw there, because this was really ground zero, I think, for a lot of the debate about what's going on in Bitcoin today.
Yeah, I thought it was a really good conference. Going in, I think I've been a little bit pessimistic lately about the progress or lack thereof in the covenants conversation. But even just from day one, there was kind of an overwhelming theme of advanced users of Bitcoin basically saying, hey, CTV and CheckSig from Stack would pretty dramatically help a lot of these exciting use cases like Arc, BitVM, Vaults. I think for anybody in the audience, it seems to me that there's pretty overwhelming demand for these upgrades. And I think what's a little bit, some context kind of around the conference is that there is a little bit of a growing divide, I think, between the sort of conventional core developers in that project and, people who are really making use of Bitcoin. There were a few people from the core project at the conference, which I was very happy to see. But none of the maintainers were there. And, at the end of the day, those are going to be the people who have to push the big green merge button, to get these upgrades.
Well, maybe let's dig into that, right? I think a lot of people who are maybe running Bitcoin as a software or just holding Bitcoin, right? This podcast is on a, platform that's more kind of for crypto general users. Bitcoin core developers, these are the softwares that are published that are the default implementation for most of the network, right? So unlike other major cryptocurrencies, there are multiple implementations in Bitcoin. There's essentially one master implementation, and it seems like some of the, I guess, frustration has been this kind of divide, as you were saying, between people who are trying to build Bitcoin applications, so essentially application level developers, and then the core developers are essentially merging these software upgrades. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. How are application developers, interfacing with Bitcoin Core, and what's that like?
The term application developer is even a little bit ambiguous, because in most cases, like in a software context, you have somebody preparing, an end user application, and maybe they're calling into some APIs and, whipping up a graphical user interface. In Bitcoin, there's kind of this striation within, so-called app developers, because there are these second layer protocols that sit on top of Bitcoin Core, presumably, which are going to help do things like scale.
Like lightning, right? Like things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So these, so-called app developers are actually highly technical. They're, really, in some cases, people who know the protocol the best, because they're, the end users who have found, the rough edges and are encountering the limitations and so forth. And, as time has gone on, I think there's been this specialization or division of labor where the Bitcoin Core project has really started to specialize in, sort of software maintenance or implementation details, or even in certain cases, policy, like the policy that governs how transactions are propagated through the network. But, in the older days, when you had people like, Greg Maxwell, more
Well,
involved.
maybe let's just go all the way back for people who are new, right? When Satoshi came around, essentially the software was one bundle, right? Kind of like everything was together, right? So I remember when I first tried to boot up Bitcoin in 2013, it was a little application. It almost looked like Skype. It looked like a consumer application that I would have been familiar with. It would sit in your little tray on the desktop. It would go up and down. It would jiggle. It would start. Kind of do things like it was felt like running a consumer level application. Is the best way that I can describe it. Over time, the mining code base is split off, the node code base, some of these things have gotten specialized. So you joined in 2011, 2012. So maybe you would have had that formative experience of kind of seeing this as a bundle. Maybe let's start there.
Yeah, I definitely remember downloading Bitcoin, as an executable and running it on my computer. I think I was either in late high school or early college. And, it was very, I mean, Satoshi was doing everything. And, he was even doing things like, the joke in reality is there was like a poker application, at least, planned. And so, he was writing scripts, he was doing the implementation, he was, I don't know if he actually did work on the GUI or if that was Vladimir initially, but
I think it was Vlad who started that, but I believe there was like a pretty rudimentary GUI, maybe even in the first one.
I guess there'd have to be, but the point is that the people working on, and it wasn't even called Bitcoin Core then, it was just Bitcoin and then maybe Bitcoin QT. But there was a very tight linkage between the people who were working on that software and the people who were actually using Bitcoin in a material technical way. And I think, like any other industry, just as time has gone on, there's been more and more specialization. And now we're at the point where the people who are maintaining the core Bitcoin software, in many cases, like maybe haven't ever written a script for real, or they're, much more concerned with the kind of software specific nature of the project, like testing, or
Yeah, it sounds like from the people who are on the more forward side of technical development, right? The issue that I keep hearing, Jeremy Rubin was on the podcast a month ago, and he essentially broke it down as in the beginning we had this kind of one client to rule them all. Now there's all these pieces of the code base, and then we've sort of seen in this fragmentation that today the Bitcoin Core developers who really kind of replaced this earlier generation. You mentioned Greg Maxwell and Vladimir von der Laan. So these would have been the initial kind of developers who really helped Satoshi in the early days. In his absence, kind of moved it forward. But we're very much technologically progressive, right? Their whole kind of motivation was to improve Bitcoin, and I think in a lot of ways, really to outcompete a lot of the other cryptocurrency ecosystem. Of course, we could debate that point, but I think they certainly saw themselves as people who were moving forward the Bitcoin project towards a certain goal, and that goal was sort of a necessity for the value and price and kind of just overall health of the Bitcoin ecosystem. And today, I think really what we're talking about is a loss of that kind of original brain power, right? There used to be this kind of meritocracy within Bitcoin. People who had worked on really early on the project, they had a lot of credibility. The community listened to them and followed their suggestions. And we've had a lapse in leadership. And it feels really that there's a conversation now about, in the wake of that, how do we move forward? How do we move forward in the wake of some of these personalities stepping back? It sounds like that's how you would describe it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a lot of complication over the last few years, including legal battles and yeah, people stepping back from the project who had a lot of context and frankly vision. I think more generally, Bitcoin's narrative has kind of changed in the sense that nobody's really thinking about payments at all anymore, kind of from a base layer perspective, which is fine. I think that's a reasonable adjustment of expectations based on the reality of the technicals. But at the same time, we're not only not thinking about payments, but really base layer scaling in general has kind of fallen out of the conversation that are happening in the conversations that are happening in the higher echelons of Bitcoin core development. Which is a really worrying condition for me because if we don't figure out a few additional advancements there, I think the integrity of the system as a whole really starts to come into question as these large holders and consolidations of coin start to get involved.
I was chatting with somebody at the OpNext conference, but I have this kind of idiom that I like to use, which is the problem with problem solving is figuring out the problem, right? It's not necessarily solving it; it's figuring out what the problem actually is. And I feel there's a lot of fragmentation within the Bitcoin development community about just this idea of what's the problem, right? Bitcoin has gone from something that was worth pennies to something that's was worth over $100,000 per coin. There's kind of this realization that technical progress we were making Bitcoin maybe no longer kind of has an association with adoption, right? I think in the 2015 era, I think it was really easy to make the argument that the technical developers were sort of moving Bitcoin forward, and there was some relationship between the development of Bitcoin and the price. I mean, certainly when Gavin would have been running like a Bitcoin faucet like early on, that would have been really hard to argue against. But now it's sort of what is the problem, and something that kind of keeps coming up is this idea of UTX ownership, right? This idea of scaling the amount of people hold Bitcoin, and so that seems to be like the problem that people who are maybe sort of having criticism with the Bitcoin core developers, it really seems to be saying there is a problem. And this certain problem is UTXO ownership. Can we talk a little bit about what UTXO ownership means and why that's sort of kind of potentially like one of the problems at play here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you took your man on the street and said, hey, how do you buy some Bitcoin? They'd say, oh, well, I go to river.com or coinbase.com or whoever,
If you got River, I'd be surprised, but it's a great product.
I'd be surprised as well. Yeah. But it is a great product.
I think you're more likely to hear Robinhood or BlackRock these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I go to my brokerage, kind of even worse, and I buy the Bitcoin, the IBIT. And now I have Bitcoin, but as you and I and probably a lot of people listening know, that's not actually Bitcoin. And even in the case of a sort of ideologically friendly company like River, if you have a balance on River, that's still not Bitcoin. It's a reliable IOU, but it's just an IOU until you actually have taken possession of the coins and you have the ability to spend those coins. And I think what people forget is that this isn't just important from the standpoint of potential confiscation. It's also really important from the standpoint of basically being able to make sure that you own coins under the rule set that you've agreed to in terms of the Bitcoin consensus rules. So, for example, in the BlackRock S1, they specifically spell out that if there's ever a fork proposed, that BlackRock basically gets to choose which side of the fork is Bitcoin, and the holder of the ETF should have no expectation that they own the other side of the fork. So really what that means is if there's any kind of a fork proposed, whether that's kind of a positive, quote unquote friendly fork from, Bitcoin developers, or whether it's a coercive fork, from some regulatory regime that wants to reintroduce monetary policy tools and a little tail emission or whatever. Someone holding the BlackRock ETF thinking they own Bitcoin, they don't get to participate in that judgment of what is Bitcoin. So that's a big problem. Another big problem is that I think a lot of people in the back of their minds think, okay, well, on-chain ownership isn't such a big deal, and we've already kind of scaled because we have Lightning, which not a lot of people actually use at this point because like the demand to actually use Bitcoin is pretty low. But the problem is that Lightning doesn't, in a sense, really solve the underlying problem of the fact that the base chain can't, say, accommodate ownership for more than 5% of Americans, because in order to actually open a Lightning channel, you have to own a coin on chain. And so
Maybe we can dig into some of that math, right? Because so the articulation of the problem is a TTX ownership, and then there's been several studies where people are sort of putting forward this idea that and it's always kind of the hypothetical. It's sort of like if everyone was using Bitcoin, if everyone was transacting, the numbers just don't work, correct?
that's right. Yeah, that's right. I think I did the math, or some napkin math, and it's a little bit hard to do because it's kind of contingent on, say, how custodians are actually dividing up their coins and so forth. But if you assume that there are roughly 300 million custodial users, and that's a number that's sort of based on a crypto.com study with the assumption that, maybe only 5% of people who hold Bitcoin are actually self-custodial, and they all wanted to withdraw, simultaneously because of some, say, impending regulatory action. If you devoted the entire chain to just processing withdrawals for those people, it would take 14 months to get everybody to their own coins. And so to me, that's a pretty big problem. It's kind of like, if you're at a bank and, the bank's like, well, we can only process, 5% of our customers for withdrawals every month, but don't worry if there's a bank run, or if it looks like we're about to have a bank run, we'll figure it out. And to me, that's just not a sufficient answer. That's not as an engineer, that's not a position I like being in. I think we should kind of anticipate these problems, especially if Bitcoin is to be an adversary technology. I mean, if you're challenging, the power of the money printer is debatably the most, powerful device on earth. And if you're going to challenge that, you have to be ready to weather some storms that include things like, sort of coercive soft fork. So I think we have to figure out at least the rough sketch of how we handle a situation like that.
Hodling isn't enough anymore. Bitcoin is evolving on Core, unlocking yield, utility, and a thriving DeFi ecosystem. With over 250 dApps and nearly $1 billion in total value locked, Bitcoin DeFi is growing fast. Hundreds of thousands of users are already staking, lending, and building on Core's high-speed, low-fee rails. Now it's your turn. Whether you're a user or a builder, the Core Ignition program rewards you for participating in Bitcoin's next evolution. Unlock your Bitcoin and use Core. Start earning with Ignition today at ignition.coredao.org/blockworks. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
Yeah, I think something that has struck with me over the last week is this idea that there are, within problems, there's different types of problems. So we have this idea that, okay, we can just declare something a problem, but there are different types of problems. So a colloquial example that drove this point home for me was, I was trying to get back in a building. Let's say I had a lot of video equipment inside, and sort of the person at the door, was telling me, theoretically, I wasn't allowed to go back up. And that theoretically, if I got up there, I would find a locked door. And theoretically, I should have had to come back the next day to get all my, very expensive equipment that I left in this building. And so there was no possible way that I could go up. And then there's sort of the practical problem, which is that I did go into the building. I did go up the elevator. I knocked on the door and there was a janitor there. He let me in, and I left with my stuff. Right. So there's a theoretical problem, and then there's the practicality of a problem. And I think when I look at this debate, there's theoretical problems. Right. UTX ownership is a theoretical problem. And then we have this idea of kind of upgrading Bitcoin, right? This idea that there could be forks. We want constituents to be active. That seems like a theoretical problem. And even this idea, I think, we haven't touched on it yet, but we'll probably get there as well. Bitcoin needs to be kind of secure against adversaries. So we need to worry about the amount of fees that are in the Bitcoin system, how many people are transacting. And then, in 2140, when the protocol subsidy runs out, we need to be able to make sure that Bitcoin is secure. Therefore, we care about the crypto economic security of Bitcoin. And these very much feel like theoretical problems. And there isn't really a practicality to them, right? Like I, as a person who uses Bitcoin today, can withdraw my Bitcoin from an exchange. I can move them to a self-custodial wallet. I'm paying very low fees, if even that at this point. And I have a high ability to, know that I high confidence that I'll be able to access those before. Don't you feel like there's I feel like this particularly feels like the problem right now because there's so many people like yourself within the development community who just see problems, but it's hard to get the community to recognize them because we're not bumping into them at all. And even some of these, with like the security debate, I mean, we might have 100 years before we need to know whether we're increasing the subsidy. So I don't know. Do you get a sense of how these conversations will move forward? Because increasingly it just seems like the two sides aren't talking well to each other.
100%. And I think it's a really powerful argument that the stuff that I was just talking about is hypothetical. It is, probably a few years in the future. I mean, I still think as an engineer, if you're designing a bridge, you don't just sort of like design for the load that you expect in the next year. You design for, you say, okay, where is this city going in terms of population over the next 20 years? But setting all that aside, so leaving the kind of tinfoil argument aside, I think the advantage that some of the upgrades on the table have is that, for say CTV and CheckSig from Stack, they are not, their usefulness is not predicated on this, like, oh, we have to avoid government capture case, because they're very generally useful tools. So, for example, some of the other uses that strike is, for vaults. I mean, I think there are a lot of people today who really want better security assurances for custodying their coins. This includes large custodians, which I'm familiar with. This includes, obviously individuals. This includes guys like Rob Hamilton, who's running Anchor Watch, which is, to my knowledge, the only, Bitcoin insurance product for custody that you can buy. This is guys, like some of the Anchorage guys really want this stuff. So I think vaults are a very compelling use case. I know there's some disagreement about them, but it's another great tool to have in the toolbox.
Well, it sounds great. I mean, obviously, right? Like if I get stolen from and there's a way for me to claw back the funds on chain, right? That seems very appealing. But I guess going to the kind of theoretical, practical debate, right? In 2015 and 2016, I think there was a much more immediacy to a lot of these problems, right? Essentially, fees were really high. There was a high on-chain footprint of users, right? A lot of people were using Bitcoin for consumer type payments, and through that kind of effort, it felt like a decision sort of had to be made, right? There was a lot of kind of community focus on that. And it seems like that's completely missing this time around, right? There just doesn't seem like there's an overwhelming angst about the technology currently. Do you feel like that's an accurate description of the 2015 to 16 era?
Yeah, I totally think that's right. And I do think that was a special time in the sense that it was a real crossroads for Bitcoin in terms of what kind of scaling strategy it was going to pursue, and maybe indeed, what its uses really are. Obviously there was a big contingent back then that thought that payments on Bitcoin were a goal and needed to be accommodated. And initially, I was kind of, I don't know if you want to get into that argument at all.
Well, I think I would like to, because I'd like to come back to the leadership problem too, right? Because I talked to a lot of the core developers, or at least the ones that I come across, about the leadership vacuum problem. And it does seem that there is this history of Bitcoin as one where the software has progressed. It's progressed through these forks of Bitcoin. There've been mostly soft forks, right? But there has been sort of this you know history of governance, right? I've made the argument myself that if Bitcoin stopped upgrading, that would be an ahistorical development, right? That would be something new occurring that hasn't occurred, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think again, it's like back in those days, all of the people involved at a high level, I think, had a vision for where Bitcoin was going. And the vision wasn't like it's sufficient in its current form. It was, hey, we need to do X, Y, Z to actually deliver on the promise of this original thing. Not even just what Satoshi originally said, but what everybody in the community right now kind of expects from Bitcoin. And as a result, you had two or more schools of thought emerge around like what needed to happen for that delivery to actually be made good on. And obviously that resulted in guys like Garzik and Gavin sort of forking off from the project, both literally and figuratively. But nowadays you just don't see that same kind of vision in any direction. It's really, I do get this sense of stasis, or if there's innovation, it's in these sort of implementation details like mempool policy. They're really in many ways kind of secondary to the chief objective of Bitcoin.
What do you feel like when you think about, maybe if we talk about the specific names like Greg Maxwell and Peter Woolley, right? They just received the Human Rights Foundation kind of like Finney Award for like their work during that period, right? And I think one of the things that I was struck by is just the modern Bitcoin culture doesn't have any understanding of them, right? And the way that they would about a Ross Ulbricht. Like one of the things that's interesting about the history project that I do is you're constantly kind of bringing the past, like you need to kind of make it relevant for the new people, right? Ross is a good example of someone who, was very relevant early in Bitcoin, but sort of, his perception has changed pretty dramatically. I would describe Greg Maxwell and Peter Woolley and then sort of early core developer team. And this is why I kind of want to talk, because you keep saying that they had a vision. So I want to kind of get into like, what did you think the vision was? As I remember it, the focus was very much on realizing Bitcoin's potential as a technology, quote unquote, and a settlement network, right? That was the big kind of verbiage of the time, right? We were going from a payments network to a settlement network. And I think what was implicit in that is that there would be sort of like many layers of Bitcoin in which, you as a user could move your Bitcoin to other systems in which the trust environments were lower, right? Like maybe I had to trust that somebody would help me withdraw my coins from this kind of layer two, but there was this aspiration that maybe I'll try to take a stab at describe it before I let you take it, where, I think there was this idea that Bitcoin could really incorporate this entire kind of financial ecosystem, that you'd be able to kind of move Bitcoin places, lock it, turn this Bitcoin into something else, gain sort of new properties for your money, and then sort of roll that all back kind of, full stack without interacting with any other human, right? So I think it would have been this idea that, contrary to maybe the Hal Finney vision, where it's like, he just thought kind of Bitcoin would have large banks and custodians, and that's how it would scale. The Maxwell and Peter Woolley version of this vision is that Bitcoin would be this full stack financial ecosystem. You'd have everything from payments to like doing equities and asset issuance and all sorts of exotic stuff, up to and including probably like esoteric financial stuff that was going on during the financial crisis. And you'd sort of be able to kind of scale that up and scale that down, and that Bitcoin would just be all of this. And so do you feel like the conversation is it about that this vision was just too big, and that just in like practice it's just like we haven't gained that much ground on this vision? Because I don't know, I don't speak to the core development ecosystem terribly often, right? I know some of the context, and we catch up in conversations and I get glimpses of it, but it does seem like very much that when I think about how we talked about Bitcoin then and what it was trying to achieve, and now there's a big delta.
So, I just as a disclaimer, I mean, I really can't speak for what Greg or Peter's vision was either at the time or now. I can only kind of give my impression of what they were going after. But I know specifically Greg years ago, when I first got professionally involved back in 2018, I was reading mailing list posts from Greg talking about Graftroot. Greg's always in the past talked about the potential use of ZKPs at some point. He was an early explorer of covenants, initially in a critical way, and now I'm not sure what he thinks. But I think the point is that he, I think, always expected, and we always expected, I think, as a community, that Bitcoin would continue to give us some tools to explore that spectrum you're talking about and develop, new patterns of financial ownership and, asset issuance and trust models that just for which there simply isn't an analog, in the traditional finance world, because this is a totally new asset type. It's totally digital. And so I think the assumption latent in everybody's minds was that there is going to be continued work on development to sort of help some of these interesting use cases come about. And you see that evidenced in, say, the way that Taproot was designed for total upgradability, where there's Leaf versions and this huge opcode space. It's like they even at the time they were kind of thinking, oh, we're going to need to do upgrades to see some of the stuff.
Yeah, I think about that one BIP where it's essentially the point of the BIP was that you would be able to have many soft forks being deployed at once, right? Like
absolutely, yeah, like simultaneous version bit deployments. Like this was just in the air. This was nobody was explicitly stating it so much, because everybody involved just kind of understood, like, we're going to be doing upgrades. Like, this thing isn't done. We're going to need more functionality that, of course, has to be implemented safely, but we're going to need more functionality to fully realize in this system. But I think coming out of the fork war, back circa 2016, 2017, there are two big hangovers from that, where I think a lot of us feel, or like I personally feel like I must have misjudged something, because these things were surprising to me. And number one was kind of, you mentioned basically this idea of like side chains,
Right.
a la Liquid, from Blockstream, where
to me that feels like it was like that was Bitcoin maximalism, as close as I can figure it, right? Part of being a historian is trying to figure out where ideas come from, and one of the things that is really striking to me, and I think people would blanch at this, but I think it is true, is that the Bitcoin development of that period was heavily influenced by Ethereum and sort of other technologies, and it was very reactive to that. And it sort of was, I think, essentially an attempt, to realize a version of Bitcoin that was competitive or could supplant Ethereum. There's a ton of contextual evidence that I don't have time to kind of get into the specifics, but I think it's pretty inarguable that Bitcoin maximalism is a reaction to the crypto sphere and sort of this kind of development ecosystem that happens outside of it. So I think I would agree with you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the idea was to watch these other systems, watch for sure Liquid, see what experiments they do, see whether, how well they work, maybe bring them back to Bitcoin, to some degree, watch Ethereum in a much looser sense, see what goes on there, maybe, import some of what works back, and preserve Bitcoin as this kind of least upper bound conservative system where we're not going to do anything super, super risky, but we're going to look at these other systems and the way they play out and kind of bring back some of the innovations that prove to be.
Well, I would say two things. Maybe I'd interject just to get your reaction on it. But I do think that, when people, especially like coming into Blockworks, right, it's a very crypto first environment. And so one of their assumptions is I don't think they understand where Bitcoin maximalism comes from. And I sort of said, well, essentially, the Bitcoin developers sort of look at the crypto ecosystem. They look down on that ecosystem because the assumption early on was sort of Bitcoin is working. How sort of dare you sort of try to capitalize on the limitations of this thing that's working? You as an ethical and sort of moral person who can make these improvements should improve Bitcoin rather than trying to sort of profit from creating a new system, even if that system sort of, I think, Greg Maxwell was very into this argument as well, that altcoins were sort of amoral. And I think his argument, Peter Todd as well, was essentially that, came from the old cypherpunk lineage where it's like Bitcoin's a working tool. Someone created it. If you are good enough to advance it, you have some sort of obligation to improve it rather than profiting from making some better version. And so that kind of feels to me like sort of the root of this. So there is this idea that sidechains then contextualize is a way to sort of say, okay, well, if you're going to experiment, let's experiment on Bitcoin, and we should unlock capabilities there. Because if we let people experiment elsewhere and they create these improvements, they will sort of be encouraged to do that, to create systems that are competitive. And I don't know, again, I think it goes back to this idea that there's something kind of wrong about you developing another cryptocurrency if you have the skills to improve Bitcoin.
Yeah, that paternalism definitely was there. I think it was fueled by the proliferation of these other systems, some of which had a bunch of merit, others didn't. And I just remember at the time it was like just being inundated with new projects and coins and ICOs, and it was I think it would be simplistic and dismissive to say like it's all garbage. But that kind of became the instinctual response after a while because it was just there, but in reality, I mean, what's ironic, there's a lot that's ironic about Blockstream, and we can talk about that, but
Yeah,
but what's really ironic is that, yes, this idea that we're going to experiment with Bitcoin primitives in this friendly system that's, a side chain where you lock up some Bitcoin in a federation and then you get to kind of play in this playground with extra functionality. Yes, it's Bitcoin friendly. It's run by Bitcoiners or whatever, but in many ways, like that environment is like more permissioned than doing some kind of a pseudonymous swap into some other EVM environment or some other chain. So I think what's funny is that Liquid kind of underwhelmed in the sense that like people didn't wind up using it a whole lot because it's in many ways no different than just locking up some coins and going into the EVM or something and then swapping back out.
Well, I think I would say that from that era, right, we sort of leave the fork war era where Ethereum, kind of these other systems, feel very dominant. They start becoming a major part of the ecosystem. That experimentation definitely moved elsewhere, and now it's sort of weird because the attitude is sort of, if there was this kind of urge to kind of carve out some area of experimentation within Bitcoin, potentially to kind of unlock these capabilities, now there's sort of this argument that, okay, well, we've seen all these capabilities elsewhere, and now we're just maybe not interested in them, right? Like that's sort of it. It's sort of this idea to kind of still kind of paint that whole sector as a failure. So what are your thoughts on that mentality?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So like basically that the altcoins acted as a kind of release valve for
Well,
innovation.
you hear this a lot, right? Like with runes or with the all the stuff around ordinals, right? It was very much like, well, this stuff doesn't work? It's boring. We don't like it, and so it should just be, continue to be on the crypto ecosystem. It doesn't add value to Bitcoin like as a project at all, right? That was like a very common refrain, I think, to the people who are upset about that.
Yeah, yeah. So are you asking for my personal evaluation on that question, or just
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, like, so we talked about the older kind of mentality, but now the mentality, it seems like, is just to kind of write off. So do you see any value, I think, in the projects outside of Bitcoin, or is your argument sort of purely Bitcoin must do this for its own, to realize its own vision, or do you see anything sort of, because Jeremy Rubin will say, hey, I think that some things are working in the crypto ecosystem, and we should bring them onto Bitcoin.
I'm still a believer in that because I think that Bitcoin is special in the sense that, this idea of an immaculate conception can't really be replicated. Bitcoin has far and away the best argument for being a true commodity. It's got the most mature mining infrastructure. It has the best shot at being something that's actually decentralized. Well, I would have felt a lot more strongly about that a few years ago. Now I'm increasingly worried given kind of the institutional capture angle, but no, I absolutely think that there are some interesting things going on outside of Bitcoin in terms of exploring the trade-off space, say, of like, you look at Solana, and Solana basically is just Ethereum reimagined, fully owning this idea that not everybody's going to run a node, that you got to fork over $20,000 to run a node. And I think if you're looking at all this from like a way zoomed out kind of crypto libertarian perspective, and you're really thinking about like, how do we get the most freedom? How do we disentangle ourselves from the fiat order? there's a whole spectrum like that you have to sort of evaluate, where it's like, okay, well, you don't have to run an AWS data center to participate in Solana. You also can't do it on a Raspberry Pi. And so I do think that's kind of an interesting space to explore in terms of what ultimately gets us out the most net utility as people who are concerned with financial innovation and freedom and those things. And I think Bitcoin desperately needs to be thinking about that question a little bit harder than it is right now.
The only thing better than stacking sats is staking them. With Core's self-custodial Bitcoin staking, you can earn yield on your BTC without ever giving up custody, no new trust assumptions, no counterparties, and no slashing risk. Still your keys, still your coins, now your yield. Here's how it works. Lock your Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network. Help elect a Core validator and start earning Core rewards, passively, securely, and without risk to your principal. And with dual staking, you can boost rewards by staking Core tokens alongside your Bitcoin. Institutions can also tap into Bitcoin at scale with top custodians. Don't let your Bitcoin sit idle, put it to work. Visit stake.core.dao/blockworks to start staking today. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
Well, yeah, I think the meta question I was trying to get at is your prior to this kind of tangent, we were talking about leadership, right? So there's this refrain amongst kind of the application developers, or whatever you want to call the movement of Bitcoin, that's becoming more vocal about upgrading again. There's this idea that Bitcoin Core, particularly the people kind of working on the main software, sort of lacks some sort of specific vision. So that if that's the case, you sort of have to substantiate, well, what was the vision that was lost, right? Like what was exactly that change? I don't really know how to articulate that very well. I think the best stab I gave at it was this idea of kind of contrasting some of Greg Maxwell's beliefs with the current developer set. But it's pretty obvious that they, within chain code, there's an AI bot that you can ask it questions and it'll respond like Greg Maxwell, right? There's still a veneration for these people within the system. And so, okay, if there's a quote leadership problem, then that goes back to what I was saying before about what's the problem, right? Like, and I think the thing with problem solving is you have to figure out what's the problem. And so, when you say that there's a leadership problem, it sounds like what you're saying is, okay, hey, we have these good ideas that we can move forward. It's just that there's no kind of permission structure to like move them forward. When in reality, it does sound like maybe there's a difference of actual like visions, right? I don't know what the Bitcoin Core vision is these days.
Well, I think to answer your question, you don't even have to necessarily spell out what the vision is or was of people who were kind of in leadership roles previously. You just have to look at certain data points. For example, the kind of casual nature with which improvements like check lock time verify, check sequence verify came along, those were deployed kind of unceremoniously with very little fanfare. They just kind of came in, Drya and Poon came up with Lightning. They wrote the paper and they said, hey, we need this like time lock functionality. And everybody said, yeah, that seems like a good idea. They wrote up an implementation, scrutinized it, and then deployed it. And those, there was sort of a rapid succession of soft forks in that time that just kind of happened, bang, bang, bang. And now you're in a position where you're seeing, Jeremy had a tweet a few days ago that was something along the lines of the time that has elapsed between SegWit and Taproot has now elapsed from Taproot to here. And we have no plan. We have no concrete activation. That's not even being talked about. So obviously you can make the argument things will slow down as time goes on and as the ecosystem matures. But what I would argue is that like we're doing ourselves a disservice in accepting that kind of blindly. But I think all you have to do is look and see that there was a lot more forward motion. There was a lot more thinking going on about these high level consensus issues. And now, You have a group of people who are simultaneously saying, "Hey, it would be really irresponsible of anybody to run a separate version of the consensus because that's a risk." No business, no miner wants to take on that risk, understandably. But on the other hand, like no one in the leadership of that project is proactively like thinking about this stuff, writing about this stuff. I mean, until recently, they weren't really even paying attention to the conversation. I can say as a core developer, there was they were dismissive of these ideas when they would come up, and any formalized attempt to talk about, hey, which direction is this going, was met with a kind of either quiet derision or very vague calls for we need more use cases. We need
Yeah, I had a conversation with one of the core developers maybe a couple years ago at Bitcoin 2023 where we kind of talked a little bit about this, and my response was essentially it seemed very common early in Bitcoin for there to be roadmaps and for development groups to maintain roadmaps, and that wasn't seen as centralization or governance in any way, right? So a good example would be around the time of the fork wars. Greg Maxwell put out a roadmap for the project that was simply acked by a number of developers, and that became the roadmap simply through some sort of consensus type process. There was, of course, developers who disagreed, and then they forked off, and there was a process by which that happened. But it seems like there's almost within the core development there's this idea that even if we had even roadmaps are bad now is
yeah.
sort of what out of the implication I got from the conversation. And I said, oh, well, that's odd because to me, they were something that simply just happened. And that seemed to be what Bitcoin development was, right? There was a group of people working together towards something. And now there isn't really a something. Maybe that's what we're talking about.
Absolutely. I think people forget that Bitcoin recently has made a kind of phase transition from an organizational standpoint, and for coming from a situation where you had this very strong leadership, this kind of visionary idea of how we were going to move forward. And I don't know if it was spurred on by the legal battles or people getting tired or the general difficulty, but we very quietly, and this wasn't talked about a lot, we transitioned to this mode that's supposedly leaderless, meritocratic. Go, anybody can come along and propose whatever the next visionary change for Bitcoin is going to be, but in reality, what has happened is that has spelled complete stasis, and there isn't.
Well, I remember my point from before, which is that I think when I was talking to them, the idea was I think there's maybe for the newer developers, they don't understand why the general Bitcoin user base is now sort of hostile to them, right? Like because they weren't around for the time period where there was so much derision around the roadmap, and sort of one of the items I brought up was that, my view on the fork wars really is that neither side really won, right? You essentially had both sides kind of lost in some way because they were wrong about the bigger picture. But one of the most fundamental theories from that era that doesn't really get aired a lot because it's very uncomfortable. And I talked to Peter Woolley about this recently, which is this idea that was put forth by Merchant Popescu, which is the idea that developers were themselves an attack on Bitcoin. And I think that it's uncomfortable because it personified an actual threats to him as a person. But I think there's a lot of power to this idea, and at some point this became very mainstream. This was essentially my point to them, was that essentially that something that emerged from the fork wars is this idea that Bitcoin development was itself kind of a folly, right? That it was essentially something that shouldn't have happened in an organized way. You sort of look at the developers almost like, I like to say that there is Merchant Popescu. He has a theory, and I would call it Mersh's paradox, which is Mersh's paradox is any upgrade to Bitcoin is indistinguishable from an attack. And because you can't tell what is an attack and what is what is an upgrade, one as a responsible sovereign Bitcoin user should just treat everything like an attack, right? And you can say that is a somewhat useless or problematic view. But I think it's pretty it's pretty amazing the extent to which it has resonated. I think it's very obviously now like sort of the dominant view of a lot of people within the culture, and that's sort of an unspoken tension here that a lot of the people who have come into Bitcoin in post 2021 they inherit this idea that Bitcoin development is somehow sort of bad, right? Or that it's something that you should oppose or can oppose. And so I'm curious your thoughts, because I think that's like the dominant thing that Bitcoin Core seems to be constrained by, right? It seems to be constrained by this idea that the user base is in some ways hostile to them. I think that that's true to an extent, right? Because I think that post the fork wars, there was this idea that, if you think about everything that was popularized, it's I, the node runner. I decide what is Bitcoin. I am in charge. You can't impose on me, and that's created. I think it's just harder to talk about Bitcoin technical development today, and it's almost like, I get the sense from talking to folks like Michael Saylor and others, is it would almost be more convenient for them if there were no Bitcoin Core developers.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. A while ago, I think I traded barbs on Twitter with Steve Barber, who is a miner, I think, or in the mining industry. And at the time, he was kind of saying, hey, there shouldn't be any funding for core devs, and that he was
Yeah.
generally hostile to that class. And at the time, I bristled at it, of course. But now I have a little bit more empathy for it, in the sense that it's absolutely right that as time goes on and as things get more complicated, it's very, very difficult from the outside to size up the implications of a change to Bitcoin. And so, the famous example of this is with SegWit. You saw the witness discount and various script constraints changed in such a way that allowed the development of inscriptions. And, a lot of people just like were driven crazy by that use of Bitcoin. So post hoc, there was this like idea that, wow, we really didn't see that coming. Oh gosh, if we make any more changes to this, they're going to be bad. And well, most, maybe all but like 100 people on Earth are really incapable of actually understanding, say, a consensus change and what all the implications are, and what the implementation risks are.
You have to admit our sort of own vulnerability within the system. I think that's like what's uncomfortable about the Bitcoin technical development process. It really gets to the point that at the heart of it, within Bitcoin, you do have to rely on larger groups. As much as we want to pretend that Bitcoin, is this thing that, our trust model is solely based on our own relationship to it. I'm not sure how true that actually is.
Absolutely. It's the whole idea of like verify everything is kind of nonsense, because many people just don't have the ability or time. I mean, I barely do. When there were things in Taproot that I didn't understand, at the time, and I think that was true of almost everybody. But the difference then is that the ecosystem felt very comfortable delegating to the people who were kind of running it. Probably they still do, but the people involved don't really have the vision. They're not talking about it, and so there isn't as much trust, and that same kind of consent manufacturing process like doesn't happen as well now. And the word that you use, paradox, is absolutely the right one. This is kind of what I was trying to get at with the consensus conundrum back when I wrote that Twitter thread a few months ago, which is that it's very difficult for me to see the way out of this, because Bitcoin really is this experiment in human organization, especially, circa 2022, 2023, now that we really have less of a kind of a visionary leadership structure in the project. And I don't know how we get out of this kind of like sand trap.
Well, I think it's particularly interesting, and I'll bring this up because I think I'm biased towards, again, I said this idea that I think that it would be ahistorical for Bitcoin to stop progressing, and therefore I have a slight bias towards it continuing, because I think otherwise you have to sort of look at it as this sort of folly, right? It's like all these kind of wars were for nothing, and they could have just not happened. So I have a bias to thinking that is not true. But then if you look at something like specific with the UTXO ownership, right? So a lot of this conversation has been like, what's the problem, right? And so the UTXO ownership one seems like something that should have resonated with the mass Bitcoin culture. Like if you think about the culture of 2022, and sort of the dominant memes, it was really like freedom money. You had the trucker movements in Canada where, they're using Bitcoin to kind of, subvert the government and carry on these protests despite financial censorship. There was kind of the COVID crackdowns where, the political right kind of came into Bitcoin because it was being debanked, right? So there's this idea that, if your complaint about the current financial system is that you're being debanked, then it would seem that the natural, you have to own your own UTXO in order to be your own bank, right? Like to use the own
That's right.
Bitcoin catchphrase. But it's odd that hasn't, the culture hasn't embrace that as a problem. And so I'm really just curious for your thoughts on like why that is, because it would seem logical that that culture could have rallied behind something like, yes, more people should own their own keys, and it seems odd that that didn't happen. So I'm just curious for your take on it, because I can't explain it.
It's baffling to me as well, but I think a lot of it probably rests in the fact that many people simply haven't seen the napkin math. They don't know how limited it is. I think it's also easy to be kind of ambiguously optimistic about the idea that, oh, we'll just have a layer two that'll bail us out, or oh, we'll all move to a Fediment, type structure. There are a lot of these like very kind of vague cosmic ideas about how we're going to scale Bitcoin, none of which have really materially panned out yet, that people kind of fall back on. But the other thing is that I think a lot of people want to just sort of optimistically assume that Bitcoin is perfect. Hey, look, number go up. We wouldn't be at 84,000 K if
I think there's this idea even that like ETFs like scale ownership, right? Like there's this idea that the ETFs and sort of these other structures that maybe the developers look at more negatively are essentially, well, to bring it back before, it's almost like we have become a lot more comfortable using the existing financial system to scale this idea that you can trade off your trust assumptions, because it seems like now people are saying, and maybe they're not saying this directly, but they're saying, okay, why go through the effort of having everything up to an ETF on chain when you could just have an ETF in real life? JP Morgan will be that ETF, and rather than being a JP Morgan layer 2 smart contract type thing, it's just an organization. You can trust that organization. Why replicate that on chain? It already exists. And I think the easy answer to that would be, well, this idea that we had for this Bitcoin kind of financial system would be better because you would have maybe more rights and privileges. Like in the case of Lightning, you can use the blockchain as an arbiter in the way that it was sort of designed. And I feel like that has been lost. I don't know how to describe it other than that, but it seems like we've become a lot more comfortable with this idea that major financial institutions and the existing financial system as is will play some role in Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think there's a kind of realpolitik truth to that. But I think, again, that people have kind of forgotten the genesis of the system. The reason we're all doing this, the reason that it was created in the first place, was to enable some kind of censorship-resistant, unconfiscatable money that wasn't closely intertwined with regulatory regimes. And so, it's like, hey, a little bit of that is okay. Yeah, you can't prevent JP Morgan from, creating a Bitcoin ETF or whatever, but like to fixate on that, or certainly to invoke that as some kind of a scaling solution, to me is like anathema to the whole point of the thing. And so even if you're one of those people and you're saying, okay, well, whatever, hey, somebody with $1,000 of Bitcoin, they can use an ETF and that's fine. I mean, I think the problem with that is that like there's this contagion effect where it's not just that person with that ETF holding that's at risk of losing their coins. It's kind of the whole system getting co-opted by this sort of thing, and maybe that's unavoidable. Maybe it's not. I'm not sure. I think probably to avoid something like that, we'd have to be a lot more nimble and kind of open-minded about how we respond to that. And that's something I haven't really thought about, but. Yeah, to embrace it explicitly. I mean, it's like, okay, go to Wall Street then.
Things like Master and things like that is definitely becoming specifically embraced. But let's talk about OpCTV and Op Check Stake from Stack, which I can't abbreviate for some reason. My mind.
Nobody can. Yeah.
CSFS.
CSFS.
So the activation process within Bitcoin, and I've been curious about this, so I'm just why hasn't there been an activation client for these, if there is this idea that some people like these upgrades enough to continue advocating for them? Because it seems like in almost every case now within Bitcoin, I guess up in the recent past, there's been this path by which things are. And intent is demonstrated by the creation of a software outside of Bitcoin Core, and then a conversation is sort of had about its integration in Bitcoin Core. So why haven't we seen that degree of seriousness, or even something like OpCat? I've been fairly shocked that no one's actually written up an implementation for it.
Well, to be pedantic, so there is an implementation for it, in the sense there's a pull request open against Core for all three of these opcodes. But specifically the reason that I think nobody's tried an activation client itself, in other words, releasing a program and saying, hey, this isn't Bitcoin Core, this is Bitcoin 3C that activates these three soft forks. I think there are two cheap reasons why that hasn't been attempted yet. Number one is that Jeremy, back in, I want to say, what was that, 22? He tried something along these lines where he released a binary, and people were just allergic. People were calling him an attack on Bitcoin. It was frankly a really childish response, I think, to a guy releasing some free software on the internet. But that was not received well broadly. And the second reason is that, look, from my experience in industry, I can tell you that miners and exchanges and broadly Bitcoin businesses are not maybe as ideological as they once were, and they're certainly not willing to take risks like running an alternate client. That's I think it's been so ingrained in the muscle memory of the industry that, like, hey, we just run Bitcoin Core, we're not thinking too hard about it, that to come along and say, hey, we're trying to upgrade Bitcoin, but there isn't broad consensus, over how we should upgrade it. Maybe you could signal by running this client. I just think there's so much institutional scar tissue from the block size wars.
But wasn't that happened during Taproot as well, right? Or am I misremembering? Wasn't there was an activation client that was pushed in favor of Taproot, and wasn't that how the whole speedy trial activation went down?
No, so Taproot was very concordant in the sense that it saw, it was very clear Core was on board, that this was going to be like the PR. There was a lot of scuffle over the exact activation method, which to me is like kayfabe. It's totally beside the point. Really, activation is just miners saying, hey, we're ready for this. And there was like this big mailing list fight, mostly involving Luke Jr. about exactly how the activation works. To me, that's like window dressing. Maybe other people will make different arguments, but with SegWit, there was definitely a lot of, you had Shaolin Fry come along, and basically, the miners were dragging their feet on signaling for activation. And so there was this talk about a user activated soft fork. And I think at some point, maybe people had started to run these Shaolin Fry clients that basically signaled, hey, we're going to start invalidating your blocks if you don't signal. But I just think some of that like out of the box thinking has gone away from a much more mature industry. Now, I mean, I do still think there are miners that look at the situation of declining fee revenue and steadily declining block subsidy, and they say, hey, like Bitcoin's, we need some more traffic on this thing as a sort of existential matter, and they're increasingly favorable to some of these, especially Cat. So it's not inconceivable to me that you might start to see miners kind of like nudge for this and maybe even signal in some way. But I do think that like a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Core is, especially some of the newer people in Core, is that like it's so uncouth to run a separate implementation. It's irresponsible. There are these consensus bugs. Oh my God, if there's a chain split, it's going to be the end of the world. I think honestly, a lot of that's overblown. And could be construed as a kind of power tactic to make sure that their position in the ecosystem isn't challenged. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but like, that rhetoric is not helpful when simultaneously the message is, well, if people really care about this, then they should be materially signaling.
Well, one of the things I think that was obvious at the conference that maybe isn't talked about enough, but part of this, and I'm curious if you think that this plays into the Bitcoin Core attitude, is that there has been a bit of a the BCH Bitcoin Cash kind of crowd was seen as sort of pariahs for a long time, right? They weren't talked about, discussed, and to a large extent, their ideas were simply like invalidated by them simply being or existing. There seems to have been a warming of that, right? And I think maybe folks like Jameson Lopp kind of coming on stage and this idea that maybe the big blockers were sort of directionally right about blocks needing to be big. Do you think that is kind of one of the uncomfortable things here, is that there's been this sort of Again, I think like nobody wants to go back and run Bitcoin Cash, and I think there was a few Bitcoin Cash people there who, they asked me how could the project, get people's attention again, and I was like, I don't
Right.
think that's possible. I mean, nobody nobody values Bitcoin Cash for whatever reason, but there does seem to be like their technical ideas there's been a warming, right? There's been in the same way we maybe now remember George Bush fondly, there's like a there's
Well,
a
I wouldn't go that far, but but I know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, my talk was about the block size, and that was in no small part because of a kind of renewed exploration on my part to revisit that discussion. I did read Hijacking Bitcoin, notionally by Roger Ver. I think it was mostly written by this guy Steve Patterson. And to be honest, I really enjoyed that, and I really because we've been swimming in orthodoxy almost uncontested for like 7 years now, and it's gotten really tiresome. I think many of our expectations have not panned out. Lightning, I think, has been, while it's functional in many senses and still very useful, it's been a huge disappointment relative to the amount of hype and VC money pumped into it. And so, I read Hijacking Bitcoin, and while you can make the argument that, maybe it's shrill or whatever, I think there
my
were,
problem with Hijacking Bitcoin is it's just not the book that I wanted it to be. I think Roger could have provided a lot from his own personal perspective. I get why he wrote Hijacking Bitcoin as a sort of ode to the Bitcoin standard. It's sort of a companion piece, right? It's probably written in the same sort of way, but I think by not kind of like really digging into like his personal vantage point of what was going on back then, I think there was a bit of a disservice done. I would have liked to have seen it look more like the Block Size War by Johnny Beer and actually be sort of like a first person account, though I get the benefit of having the argument at least kind of solidified in its own.
and I think that's what it was. So from a historical perspective, I can totally see what you're saying, how it could have been a disappointment there. But just for me personally, it was a prompt to revisit like many of the macro design choices that have been made about Bitcoin, in the last few years, and to look at like the fact that it's increasingly seeming like to scale Bitcoin, even if you have these layer twos, you're probably going to need to think about the block size. And I think that they do a good job of emphasizing the fact, I've got a buddy, I won't name him, but good friend of mine, his Bitcoin origin story was, chance encountering Roger Ver at DEF CON, not knowing who the hell he was, Roger talking about this thing called Bitcoin. They go out to dinner, and he pays for dinner. Roger pays him back. He says, hey, download Mycelium on your phone, and he sends him some Bitcoin. And it's like a light bulb on moment for this guy, because at the time there wasn't Venmo, there wasn't Cash App, like getting money on your phone immediately was like this new thing. And so I think the book is interesting because it's kind of written from the perspective of like, it makes you consider whether the peer-to-peer payments thing actually would have been a good way of de facto scaling self-custody. Maybe to some degree, whether the payments thing would have been a good de facto way of scaling self-custody with merchants and so forth. And I think there are still big technical problems with that, but it is just a very interesting thought experiment to go through. So for me, like reconsidering the Bitcoin Cash perspective has been very instructive, and I think it's something we need to do, because like I think in many ways, Bitcoin hasn't performed other than in a price perspective.
Yeah, I do think though that it's hard to categorize that, right? Like how is it specifically not performing, and by what basis that's not great? And that sort of goes back to what I was talking at the beginning about, like what's the problem, right? And it's sort of I think right now there's you can talk about specific soft fork implementations, but I think within the Bitcoin community there's sort of the sense of, okay, like, well, what's the problem? And the lack of consensus about a problem sort of leads, the question that I come to is how could we be anywhere else other than where we are? Because it just seems like from the things that we talked about, there isn't a sense that there's a problem, and so how can there be a sense that there's a solution? And then if we're not going to talk in a problem solution dynamic, then we have to defer to this idea that there's some sort of process, right? And that maybe we owe ourselves some sort of continued upgrade path simply to get people to continue to develop Bitcoin and think of ideas, which also feels sort of unfulfilling. So, I'm kind of at a loss for where we go. I think one of the things that stuck out at the weekend was this idea that maybe some of the ARC people were pushing forward that some of the things that are possible with layer twos are possible with ARC, or at least there's a design space there that can sort of fill the void in this conversation. What do you make of that claim?
I think there is some to that claim, but I just want to really quickly revisit what you were saying there about how do we kind of know that Bitcoin isn't performing. And I think one of the really important things to look at is how empty the mempool is right now. And if you had come to me in 2017 and said, "Hey, guess what? Bitcoin is at 84K. It's 2025. What do you think fee rates look like?" I'd say, "Oh yeah, they're like astronomical. It's just 300 sats per VByte or whatever." And we're really on our way to having a replacement for the security budget that isn't the block subsidy. And I think the fact that the mempool is just a ghost town is kind of evidence that like it's the Yogi Berra, nobody goes there anymore because it's too busy. We've kind of scared everybody out. There isn't really a compelling reason to use it aside from these things, these occasional things like ordinals and runes. And so I do think that should be a big warning bell for a lot of people. And maybe we're going to start talking about it increasingly. In terms of ARC as a layer two, look, my story about ARC, my bull case for ARC, as far as I can see, is that it's going to be a better Lightning, in the sense that some of those interactivity requirements are reduced. It's easier to actually have a sort of pseudo self-custodial wallet. But I think the big lesson coming out of Lightning is that for these complicated layer two patterns, it's very difficult ahead of time to have any confidence about like whether they're workable in practice or not, or what the usage actually kind of feels like. So as an example, I was talking with some guys a few days ago just about ARC and saying, "Oh man, like this is really cool. I'm excited to see where this goes. It's great that there are supporters of CTV. It seems like a perfect kind of example of that." And they say, "Well, yeah, it is cool, but what do the economics look like? Like, even if your capital requirements are 5% of the volume, within the ARC over some period of time, like who's paying to lock up that capital? Who's willing to give the opportunity cost, pay the sort of interest rate?" And so then it's kind of this like, well, where does the yield come from question? Like, is anybody actually using payments on Bitcoin? I don't think so, aside from hobbyists. And so then it's like, okay, well, if you have low velocity, then you're going to have higher fee rates. And like, if the mempool is empty-ish, are these hobbyists really going to want to pay the fee rates? So I think they're big like kind of macroscopic questions about ARC, even assuming the implementation works out. And then like kind of, does anybody care is the big gauntlet that has to be passed. For me personally, I think it is really important that we have a sketch of a workable layer two if all of a sudden there is a huge demand for gray market Bitcoin use. I still think as an engineer that's important, but I think we also have to reckon with this question, like, does anybody care?
So do you think the security budget long term, it sounds like for the people who just dismiss that as an issue, like you think that the security budget will still be a long-term issue?
I think it's a huge issue because the thing that should, make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, if someone mentions in the context of Bitcoin, is somehow undermining the property rights, is, introducing a tail emission, changing the supply schedule. Those things totally undermine the premise of Bitcoin. But if you get into this situation where the subsidy's going away and fee rates aren't high and maybe the price is in a similar place, it starts to get very uncomfortable. And the amount of time that we have to resolve that question is not much, in the sense that 2 halvings from now, you're gonna have a pretty drastically reduced subsidy. That's 7.5 years away. Think about how quickly the last 7 years went from 2018 to here. It's like, it doesn't feel like all that much happened. So I do think it's a question people have to start grappling with.
We're talking about the nature of problems, right? And one of the things is that our perception of problems can change over time, right? So the example that I think is most pertinent, say when Vitalik Buterin founded Ethereum, he was convinced proof of work was a problem. Right? Used too much energy, people were going to want something else. Therefore, proof of stake is sort of baked into the roadmap of Ethereum. And I think Ethereum's whole, it can't really get away from that, right? Even though now most of their community or some of their community might say, okay, well, it was a mistake to prove a mistake, they can't get away from that initial assumption. I'll give you another example, would be Litecoin. The assumption of Charlie Lee when he made it was that it would be faster for payments, and that's why people would use Lightning. So Litecoin is only as useful as its originator's assumption of the problem was. So we've seen like this, that in this ecosystem, problems change. Like things that we thought were problems are no longer problems. So for some like UTXO ownership or security budget, or just the idea that we'll need kind of trust minimized upper layers on Bitcoin. It's like, how can we be certain that any of these things, just because we think they're problems today, how can we be certain that there'll be problems tomorrow? It seems like we can't.
Yeah, I just think that's right. But when you start hand waving away whole collections of problems, the chance that they sort of accumulate to undermine the system in a fundamental way, goes up. So my big question as an engineer is like, what can we get without sacrificing much or anything? It's like, what are the engineering possibilities? What's the trade-off space look like? And you can reasonably come to the conclusion that, hey, we shouldn't do anything, whatever, but you need to have the discussion. You need to do the benchmarks, and nobody's really doing that. Not a lot of people are thinking about kind of the macroscopic path of Bitcoin as an engineering project. The considerations are much smaller. So, like, yeah, look, I want nothing but the best for all this stuff. I think even if maybe we don't change it, maybe it does something good, but I'm not sure about that. And it's just such an important opportunity that we've been given that I'd hate to see it. I'd hate to see us get lazy and kind of squander the opportunity just because it's difficult.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm biased towards wanting the technology of Bitcoin to keep upgrading, but I don't know. I'm sort of at a loss to this very problem of what is the problem. We have some theoretical problems. It just seems like we can't be sure that they'll turn into actual problems. And meanwhile, we're finding Bitcoin to be, it's 60% of the market cap for all cryptocurrencies right now, and so little of it has fundamentally changed. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to figure out my own personal motivation on it. I tend to be a little bit more of a centrist. I tried to see the good in runes and ordinals when that was happening. I think a lot of these proposals, seem interesting. I get the motivations for why people are proposing them. But I also get why the culture, I think, is apathetic, despite what they, some of this. So I don't know how to take this forward. I can't solve this one.
It's a tough one because you could have made the argument of a taproot. It's like, oh well, if we don't do taproot, like Bitcoin will be fine. Like this is we're just inventing problems. Like you don't really need Schnorr signatures. Like okay, a little bit of extra privacy for scripts. Like who cares? You could sort of have made the argument at every step of the way, especially about SegWit. I mean, my big beef here is that SegWit and Taproot were these massive engine lift changes that are like reinventions of how script interpretation works on Bitcoin. And you could have made the argument at that point, okay, we're good, done, don't touch it, whatever.
Well, some people did, right? And that's why when I had the opportunity to talk to Peter Woolley, it's the one thing I talked to him about was Moshe Popescu, who froze the code at version 0.5 and told everybody to go pound sand, which was basically it's almost like what is Bitcoin development within the history of Bitcoin, and like how much of Bitcoin development is or was useful, right? Like that seems to almost be like the meta conversation here, because and I think like evoking extreme positions like is helpful, right? So like this is why Moshe is like a great way to kind of contextualize this argument. Is his opinion was like everybody after Satoshi was useless and was attacking him, and so therefore he just like was like, you don't exist, I'm gonna build my own thing, and like I can do that within the technology, so thanks, go get lost. And that seems nice, right? Like it seems like we actually that's a good thing. But then also obviously Bitcoin's a software, it needs to change. We never know with the quantum stuff, right? There's a lot of that's a new kind of potential problem. Maybe that turns into a problem, and maybe that's what we have to solve. But I don't know. It's this lack of a hard problem right now that just feels like the main problem for upgrading is that we really can't put our finger on something, and I think that just creates kind of where we're at, which is that there's a malaise, right? Minus somebody creating the impetus for some of the stuff to be put in practice.
Yeah, that's right. And, I do have some optimism coming out of that conference because there was a sort of overwhelming thread of, hey, these two tools we really like. We'd love to use them. So, I think the next few months will be interesting in that sense to see if something develops there, if there really is an overwhelming consensus, and maybe the core guys go, yeah, okay, we see it now. We'll facilitate this conversation. I think that'd be a great outcome. But yeah, it's hard to argue with any of what you're saying. It's a tough problem. I think it may be kind of intractable, but it'll be really interesting to see where it all goes for sure.
Well, we'll put a bookmark in it. James, appreciate you joining. Where can people check out your work or read your writing? I know that you've written a number about these subjects, or people can dive in more.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter at JamesOB, and that's probably the best place to find me.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for joining. This has been a Supply Shock podcast. We're going to be seeing you and continuing these discussions more in Brooklyn, New York. Permissionless coming at you June 24th to the 26th. The crypto development world will be descending to talk about their problems. We'll be bringing some Bitcoiners to talk about our problems. I'll be there. Hope to see you at blockworks.co to get tickets and more information. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're catching this on Twitter, give us a retweet, give us a comment, let us know how we have done. This has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.